Good afternoon. It's Friday the 2nd of December 2022, just after 1 o'clock. Welcome to UK Column News. I'm your host, Mike Robinson, and joining me by video link, we've got Patrick Henningsen from 21st Century Wire and Vanessa Beeley. Welcome both to the programme. We're going to get straight on with the Chuckle Brothers because they are back. Here they are, Professor Whitty and Valance. They've published a new report, which is supposed to be for the future chief medical officers to deal with COVID and so on, but they're talking about a prolonged period of excess death. So we'll come on to exactly what they say in a second. But this, of course, is the latest from the Office for National Statistics, and we have another week of excess mortality compared to the 5-year average. But well, it was very interesting looking this report that Whitty and Valance have released. It was supposedly from the Department of Health and Social Care. So I had a look at the Department for Health and Social Care's Twitter feed to see if I could find the report itself. No, of course not. I couldn't, but I was told I needed to get boosted. I was also told that £22.5 million is going to research into cancer to develop new immune-based cancer therapies. This, of course, means mRNA. And I was also told that the NHS is delivering on its winter plan because, of course, the Tories deliver on everything. And they've established 40 healthcare traffic control centres, and that's dedicated 24/7 teams, helping to get patients into beds as quickly as possible. So there's 40 healthcare traffic control centres, pioneering centres which are using data to respond to emerging challenges. So no extra beds. That's going to deal with data, and that's really important. This move is part of the NHS's wider winter plan, is published in October, which also included the rollout of national falls response team services, new hubs dedicated to serious respiratory infections, and statistics also showed that more than 19 and 20 adult general and acute beds were occupied in the week to 20th of November. This is what Steve Barclay had to say, the Health Secretary. It's absolutely vital we use the latest cutting edge technology and data to ensure the NHS is performing as efficiently and effectively as possible. So, Patrick, I don't know if you've got any thoughts on this initially, but it's just staggering to me that they shut down or at least they vastly reduced the number of beds in order to make social distancing possible for COVID, to deal with COVID. They're not bringing those beds back, but we're going to focus on making sure that they've got the data necessary in order to produce reports to tell us how long the ambulances are waiting in queues outside hospitals.
Yeah, it's, so they're stuck on stupid, basically. They've had all this time to reflect on this disaster. It's also the conspicuous absence of Whitty, Valance, and Matt Hancock from the public view in the last sort of year or so, or a better part of a year. And all of a sudden they're coming back. I think there's maybe an attempt to rehabilitate these people and perhaps to rehabilitate their legacy, which is the total disaster, the unmitigated disaster that's COVID response in the UK. But the NHS, this is predictable what's happening because they created a problem, which is massive waiting lists, staff shortages, shortages of doctors, qualified doctors, in moving to telephone healthcare. So they've created this. So it's data, it's big data, and it's remote services, and it's basically treating the NHS not unlike big agriculture. So there's basically the way you treat livestock. And I'm not making a sort of crazy flippant comparison there. If you look at how things have changed in the NHS in terms of the personal care that's being delivered or access to actual doctors, it is moving in the direction of big agriculture in the way that they're administering it. So this is the realm of the technocrats. It's all about big data, and they'll be with their PowerPoint presentations and new ways to move people through the system, or seem to be, but nobody's actually getting any actual health care, not of any high quality anyway. But it's a victory for the government because it's all about boasting lowering waiting times and the increasing efficiency and all of this stuff, but nothing about the actual quality of the healthcare that the individual is getting.
Indeed. So if the report from Whitty and Valance wasn't on the the Department of Health's Twitter feed. Maybe it was on their website. So let's have a quick look there. Well, in fact, no, it's not there either. Maybe it's on the coronavirus COVID-19 page. Well, no, it's not there either. So how about the public health page? It's not there either. Eventually tracked it down on the Chief Medical Officer's annual reports page, which is buried on the government website. Very hard to find. So let's just have a look and see what this technical report on the COVID-19 pandemic in the UK had to say about the excess mortality issue. And here it is. Healthcare professionals, says Chris Whitty and co. We're working in highly pressured environments with potential significant exposure to transmission risk for a novel and largely unknown pathogen. So as Patrick has said, they are doubling down on this narrative as they try to rehabilitate themselves. Morale across the workforce was understandably closely linked to the overall direction of the pandemic and the broader public mood. But hold on a second. What drove the broader public mood? Well, in fact, it was Whitty, Valence, the likes of Spy B and the SAGE team. So he can't blame the broader public mood for what happened in the NHS when it was him that set that. He goes on, there was a need to balance the need for surge and service adjustment to meet pandemic needs with maintaining an appropriate level of care and support for other health needs. But of course they didn't do that because the first thing they did was to remove half the beds. I don't mean that literally, some quantity of beds because they needed to distance people from each other in wards. We never actually discovered how many beds were removed over that period of time. Shifting to remote consultations, Patrick already mentioned that, and Debbie, of course, has been mentioning that for weeks, but he goes on. Shifting to remote consultations, discouraging unnecessary health setting presentations, and asking that those with specific symptoms avoid healthcare settings unless necessary has been an effective way to reduce potential transmission risks and additional burden during a time of significant pressure. Additionally, advice discouraging presentation in healthcare settings when people had certain symptoms needed to include caveats and routes for appropriate triage where these symptoms were not highly specific. Of course, that didn't happen either. Communications to discourage unnecessary visits to healthcare settings therefore needed to be continually adapted. Well, he may argue that he continually adapted his communications in this regard, but in fact, in practice, did people hear that, the subtlety of that? Well, I don't think they did. He goes on here, there's little doubt that delays in presentation, reductions in secondary prevention, postponement of elective and semi-elective care and screening will have led to later and more severe presentation of non-COVID illness, both during and after the first three waves. And he goes on, the combined effect of this will likely lead to a prolonged period of non-COVID excess mortality and morbidity after the worst of the pandemic is over. So, Patrick, let's have a guess how many times Chris Whitty mentioned the possibility that some of this excess mortality is related to the vaccine rollout. I'll let you guess that first before I comment further.
It's probably something between 1% and 0%. I don't know.
Well,
But
zero indeed, yes. But anyway, go
yeah,
ahead.
no, they're still, they won't say explicitly that the pandemic is over. There's still a lot of people referring to it. Certainly in the United States, they're clinging to it. The Biden administration will not admit that there's a pandemic that's over. They're just clinging to it. So we're in the latter stages of the pandemic, this kind of protracted end of the pandemic. This has gone on now for like a year or 2 years now. So how long is it? It's definitely going to stretch through this winter. We're not at the end yet. We're still in the pandemic. So all the emergency use authorization, this is basically a stay of execution for the kind of emergency authorization of the experimental mRNA gene jabs. That's all this is, because nobody wants to face the music, much less Chris Whitty or Valence, the Chuckle brothers. They don't want to face the beast that they've created and the sort of potential tort tsunami coming in terms of lawsuits against the pharmaceutical companies, public health agencies, and so forth. All these people that are pushing and mandating this experimental pharmaceutical product. So I think that has a lot to do with it. So just the language it says it all, Mike. What you just put there shows that they're still kind of drifting it on through the winter of 2022, 2023. And then what? Have to wait for another crisis to bury the last one? I don't know.
Well, indeed. Well, look, we'll come back onto the end of the so-called end of the pandemic later on in the program. But if we've got excess mortality in the UK being caused by health care issues, there's certainly mortality building in Canada. Now, we talked about this briefly on last week's Extra, on last Friday's Extra. But Vanessa, we want to go into this in a little bit more detail.
Yeah, pretty horrifying. I mean, a number of independent media have picked it up and approached it from different angles. This is a blog post from a blogger called thebridgehead.ca.canada. Canada's new euthanasia law threatens your loved ones who suffer from mental illness. Now, this was back in March 2021. If we have a look at the content of the blog, Mike, so from the blog itself, experts have been predicting a pandemic of mental illness stemming from the COVID-19 pandemic and the government response to it. So, surprise, surprise, there are mental issues as a result of the extreme measures taken by the UK government, for example, and of course the Canadian government, which was one of the most draconian. Now, again, as part of the blog, never before has Canada offered suicide rather than prevention. This is very important here. Canada is this entire, what I would describe as a sort of transhumanism, which is rebranded eugenicism program, is being put through by the majority of the Five Eyes countries, but Canada is leading the way. Bill C7 was introduced last February, so that was at the same time as COVID-19 broke out, so February 2020, after the Quebec Superior Court's Truchon decision struck down the 2015 law's requirement that someone's death be reasonably foreseeable before they became eligible for assisted suicide. Unsurprisingly, the Trudeau Liberals didn't bother to appeal the decision and instead passed Bill C7 in December 2020. The Senate amended the legislation to allow those with mental illness, and we also have to ask who asserts that somebody is eligible for the mental illness fast track towards medically assisted assistance in dying, which is MAID, that's the Canadian program, and has no other disease or condition eligibility for assisted suicide. In other words, you can be eligible for assisted suicide simply if you are suicidal. So rather than offering prevention, they are offered suicide. Back to that point. Bill C7 removed the requirement in the law that a person's natural death be reasonably foreseeable in order to qualify for assisted death. Therefore, people who are not terminally ill could die by euthanasia. The Truchon decision only required this amendment to the law, but Bill C7 goes further. I'd recommend going to this particular blog to get further information, but it also includes the fact that the 10-day waiting period for those with foreseeably fatal illnesses has been waived, and the fact that doctors and nurses can lethally inject a person incapable of consenting. Just let that sink in a minute. So medically assisted suicides in Canada, you can see there a clear increase leading up to 2021. So if you look at from 2020, which is when the whole COVID project kicked off, to 2021, there's a clear and quite dramatic increase. But even from 2016, obviously, when the bill was introduced. Moving on, Mike. So recommend reading this article. There's a lot of interesting information in it, considering it's a mainstream article. Federal Minister Carla Qualtrough, Minister of Employment, Workforce Development and Disability Inclusion, said that she's shocked by the suggestion of assisted deaths for some babies. Let's have a look at what she means by that. So basically, I find that completely shocking and unacceptable that infants less than a year old should have access to medically assisted deaths if they are unlikely to survive and are dealing with severe health issues. The idea was raised earlier this month at a parliamentary committee hearing reviewing the federal law that governs medical assistance in dying. Dr. Louis Roy of Quebec's College of Physicians said his group believes assisted death could be offered to babies up to 1 year old with severe deformities and very serious syndromes for which the chances of survival are virtually nil and which will cause so much pain that a decision must be made not to allow the child to suffer. Now, Mike, one issue that I wanted to raise here, how much of the diseases that are going to be upcoming in the future, or even defects using their kind of terminology, are related to vaccines, either to the mother or to young children? That has to be a question which they are not raising, but which we need to raise, bearing in mind the correlation between this act and the COVID project, right?
Yeah. Yep. Okay. Go on ahead.
Going on. This is shocking for me. Qualtrough said it should not be easier to access a medically assisted death than to get a wheelchair, but it is. Again, I recommend reading this article. It is really seriously disturbing, and what the hell is going on in Canada? Okay, moving on. We're coming on here, Mike. You mentioned in, I think it was Extra last week. This was an opinion piece from Maria Zaharova.
And we've just lost
Vanessa.
So,
as I will remind you that the Third Reich, with its Action T4 program, was the first. Oh.
It's okay. Keep going, because we'll bring Zakharov on here.
I haven't got the slide anymore.
Yeah. Okay. So I'll read it out while we go here. Okay. So Zakharova said this. If we could put that on screen, please, Stephanie. Canada legalized physician-assisted suicides in 2016. The number of people who wish to be euthanized has been growing annually. In all probability, Canada will reach 50,000 such deaths a year. I'll remind you that the Third Reich, with its Action T4 program, was the first state to introduce euthanasia on a mass scale. Apart from racial prejudice, the Nazis proceeded from economic considerations. It was expensive to pay for people requiring treatment. This was a tax burden. According to a document found in the Hartheim Euthanasia Center in Nazi Germany, 70,273 people were killed under the Tiergarten Strasse 4 program by September the 1st, 1941. An unknown Nazi clerk noted with chilling pragmatism, considering that these patients could live for another 10 years, this is a saving of 885,439,800 Reichsmark in total. And then she ended by saying, is the motivation of neoliberal Ottawa different from that of the Reich? Judge for yourselves. Yeah, I'm afraid we've lost Vanessa. So what we'll do is while we see if she can reconnect, I'll just run on through this here. She wanted to highlight this tweet from Ian Miles Chung. Canadian clothes retailer Simons is actually using suicide to market their products. No, this isn't made up. It's part of a sweeping effort to introduce medically assisted suicide as a treatment for mental illness, PTSD, and even children with defects in Canada. So let's just have a quick look at a little piece of promo video that this clothes manufacturer Simons pushed out.
Last breaths are sacred. When I imagine my final days, I see bubbles. I see the ocean. I see music. Even now, as I seek help to end my life, there is still so much beauty. You just have to be brave enough to see it.
So all is beauty, apparently. So a Canadian retailer exploits a young artist's euthanasia to market its fashions. And if we just look at the content of this, it's saying sometime after Canada's Thanksgiving Day, on the 10th of October, a 37-year-old woman named Jennifer was euthanized A few days later, on 24th of October, one of Canada's best-known fashion retailers, Quebec-based La Maison Simon, launched an advertising campaign based on her wish to die. Euthanasia was, as performance art is the prerogative of the well-to-do, the well-connected and the privileged. Euthanasia as social injustice will be the lot of the down and outs, the abandoned and the marginalised, says this article. If Simon's really valued community connection and compassion, it would be subsidising housing and medical care for people like this. Instead, it's exploiting the death of a young artist to burnish its brand as a champion of progressive values. So let's see what comes next. All is beauty. So this is more from the American Conservative covering this. And the quote here is Peter Simons, the CEO, who said the short film discloses the heart of the company's values and was made to help build human connection and encourage people to be moral and to help build the communities we want to live in tomorrow and leave to our children. Everything we admire on this earth today, science and art, technology and inventions, is only the creative product of a few people's. This is now a quote from Adolf Hitler that Vanessa was wanting to compare with the Simons quote. Is only the creative product of a few people's and originally perhaps one race. On them demands existence of this whole culture. If they perish, the beauty of this earth will sink into the grave with them. Then let's see what else we've got here. Then we've got the New York Times. New York City to involuntarily remove mentally ill people from the streets. Mayor Eric Adams directed the police and emergency medical workers to hospitalize people they deemed too mentally ill to care for themselves, even if they posed no threat to each other. So the links between euthanasia and eugenics, Patrick, are there. And what's going on in Canada is taking it really to an extreme.
Yeah, the numbers are staggering. These are industrial scale numbers. Just I think the last year or so is like 18,000. It'll be projected to be 30,000 such people on this sort of official death pathway in Canada. I think it says a lot about Canadian society. I think it says a lot about the politics in Canada. And if you look at the COVID response, if you look at Justin Trudeau's policies, he's a highly unpopular political leader, has managed to crowbar himself into power once again in the last election. But his policies are generally not popular. But you have this kind of supine attitude that a lot of Canadians have in their way, sort of a stiff upper lip, hoping that it's just all going to go away and go back to normal. But the main feature, Mike, here is this idea of nihilism. And you see it embedded in the text. They're trying to mainstream this idea of the kind of certain destruction of death. This is what the climate change narrative feeds into. It's nihilism. If you look at the history of the Weimar Republic and what society was like, what was the milieu of culture that preceded the Third Reich, or the conditions that created the rise of the Third Reich, and then the economic depression after World War I, and you have this kind of opulence, you have this progressivism, and one of the outgrowths of that is this attitude of nihilism. And I will argue that that's really what the climate change campaigning is all about. It's about raising the current generation, the Greta Thunberg generation of children, to really believe that their future has been robbed by the adults and the baby boomers who've destroyed the planet and their future. And therefore, hey, what's the point of having children? This kind of, and what's the point of being alive, for that matter? But this all started really with in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. These ideas have been groomed and brought along and are now percolating to the point where you have like literally a Logan's Run type narrative that they're pushing there and doing it with all this kind of corporate sheen to it. It's kind of really kind of vulgar in a certain way, but they'll say that, no, this is really high progressive thinking. And so big danger here, I think, for society if this sort of thing becomes seductive or becomes alluring to the intelligentsia and they start pushing this. But there will be pushback to this. There will be a visceral reaction as well. So get ready for that.
Okay, well, I just want to, Vanessa just wanted to finish this segment off with a little clip from Redacted, who were talking, because as I said, the connection between euthanasia and eugenics perhaps isn't clear to some people, but let's just have a quick listen to this.
Now, under the MAID laws in Canada, this is unbelievable part of the story. Canada's Pediatric Society says it's okay to basically eliminate children, as long as they show signs that they are mature.
What does that even mean?
Let me repeat that. Canada's Pediatric Society, under these MAID laws, basically says, hey, if the child is mature enough, like they're not an adult yet, not 18, but if they're showing signs of maturity, then they can. We're going to refer to them as mature minors, and they can make the determination to kill to be assisted suicide and taken care of.
Basically, if they can decide their own gender, they can.
No, but this is the same. Yeah, you make a good point. This is the same thing. Is that children should be able to change their bodies, make these decisions, make adult decisions as minors.
Oh, you're 12 and you're depressed? Well, here you go. We don't even need to check with the parents. You're a mature minor. You're 12. You seem like you're mature. Do you want a doctor's note to go and take care of that thing called life? Like that's what we're talking about here.
We have the red and blue pill. We have the hormone blocker or the life taker. Which one do you want, red or blue?
Yeah.
Yeah. Because continuing to live how you are right now is not an option.
Unbelievable. Mature minors.
Vanessa, it looks like you're back. Welcome back. We've gone through the material. So just if you've got any closing thoughts on that.
No, I mean, I presume you showed the fact that obviously Chrystia Freeland, who's been instrumental in getting this bill through, has connections back to her great-grandfather, Michel Chomiak, who effectively ran the Krakow news in Ukraine, which promoted Nazi programs and Nazi propaganda, including the T4 euthanasia program. And it's also worth noting that he had a close connection to PR for Goebbels himself. And Goebbels in 1941 commissioned a film called Ich klage an, I Accuse, which was the story of a woman with MS who pleads with her doctor husband to end her life. It was seen by 18 million people. And of course, remembering that at the end of the war, it's an estimated 300,000 that were exterminated as part of the euthanasia program, but also not forgetting the forced sterilization program that was running alongside that.
Yeah, okay, thank you for that. Now, if euthanasia and potentially eugenics are all about creating the right kind of human being, I wonder what Elon Musk has been up to. Now, he has decided to update everybody on what's going on with his robotics and AI company, or human augmentation, we might call it. And so he held a live stream yesterday where he's basically talking about his latest efforts to interface the human brain with microchips. And he's saying that he's going to have a chip ready to be implanted in clinical trials within the next 6 months. So we have a short clip from that live stream. Let's have a listen to what he was saying yesterday.
The overarching goal of Neuralink is to create ultimately a whole brain interface. So a generalized input-output device that, in the long term, literally could interface with every aspect of your brain, and in the short term, can interface with any given section of your brain and solve a tremendous number of things that cause debilitating issues for people. So, so our long term is I'll talk a little bit about our long term goal. It's going to sound a little esoteric, but it was actually the sort of my prime motivation, which was, what do we do about AI? Like, what do we do about artificial general intelligence? If we have digital superintelligence, that's, just much smarter than any human. How do we mitigate that risk at a species level? How do we mitigate that risk? And then even in a benign scenario where the AI is very, very benevolent, then how do we even go along for the ride? How do we?
So Patrick, I don't know what you think of that. Have you any thoughts on what he's just said?
On the AI question, he's talking about the singularity, a sentient artificial intelligence. And I think a lot of that debate, that conversation, people who work in AI, top developers in artificial intelligence, whether they're from Hanson Robotics or they're from Google working on the DeepMind project, they'll tell you that we are so far away from the singularity as a sort of sentient AI has actual artificial intelligence. What you have now across all of these applications currently is narrow AI. So this is the ability to execute tasks, but do lots of different tasks based on processing power at a rapid rate. And hence it gives the appearance of artificial intelligence, but it has artificial competence. This is very different than artificial intelligence, is what Musk is talking about. So a lot of it's pie in the sky. A lot of it's just pie in the sky. But the problem with the Elon Musk conversation, at least in the alternative media sphere, is that there's two concurrent things going on. One of them is this debate about transhumanism and Elon Musk's role in that. And certainly that's a good thing to discuss and debate and flesh out. Then there's the other conversation now that he's taken this sort of vanguard position on free speech, which we'll talk about in a few minutes later in the segment. But these are two separate concurrent conversations going on. And a lot of people have the tendency to conflate both of them and then to basically dismiss Elon Musk's activities on Twitter, for instance, as an example, or other areas, and then conflate it with this nefarious transhumanist agenda. So I think we got to separate these two things because they might not actually be directly connected, although you can say he wants to roll out the one app with the X app and all of this stuff, but still, we actually do need a digital town square. We need a space for free speech and discourse. If Twitter becomes more open in that regard, that is a positive thing. And so he could be doing two different things, positive, negative. You have to sort of separate these things and look at them separately rather than, because a lot of people just want to write him off as a complete demon. And although some of the work might appear to be demonic, no doubt, we got multiple things going on, which makes it a little bit more complicated.
Right. Well, we will be talking about that a little bit more in a second. But in the meantime, if we stick with the narrow AI, at least, of course, he is promoting this as in the short term as being some way to deal with medical issues that people have in terms of Parkinson's disease or some kind of problems with limbs or whatever. But in the meantime, of course, one of the main reasons for the pursuit of AI or one of the main areas of interest is in the defence industry. And the UK government continuing on with this is the DSTL. We've hosted a pioneering AI trial to build data sets to improve target recognition. And everywhere we go in the UK at the moment, we have this data set building exercise going on in every government department, and ultimately it's being plugged into machine learning and AI to some degree. And of course, alongside this, the UK government, the Ministry of Defence, has its Defence Artificial Intelligence Strategy. Let's just see what Ben Wallace had to say when this was published. AI has enormous potential to enhance capability, but is all too often spoken about as a potential threat. AI-enabled systems do indeed pose a threat to our security in the hands of our adversaries. So it's only when AI is in the hands of adversaries that it's a problem. But my question, Patrick, is who are the adversaries? Because if we remember what the UK Ministry of Defence position is on adversaries, home is no longer a secure sanctuary because they view the general public as being adversaries. And so my question, Patrick, very briefly is, if the UK government and the Ministry of Defence see the general public as being an adversary and they hold the AI, but they see AI in the hands of an adversary as being a risk, should the public therefore view what the British government using this type of technology as a risk to them.
Right. So the public, at least in Britain or in the West, in the sort of free democratic West, the conversation about AI, all these boffins will like to sort of project and make that sort of a conversation about foreign power, about the Chinese and what the Russians are going to do if the AI falls into the wrong, evil hands of some nefarious foreign dictator. But the real conversation should be a domestic one. It's how your government will apply these technologies in local law enforcement, in a domestic setting. And if you look at the NHS, completely reliant on big data, on narrow AI, on ML, machine learning, and this is how they're going to administer national health care. And the police are moving in that direction. Last week, we talked about the autonomous robots in San Francisco being shoot to kill, being given legal license for that. That passed this week, by the way. So they will be moving forward with that particular program, and they do have license to kill in certain circumstances. So the conversation should be a domestic conversation and not one about foreign. So I think the media will always project internationally on this against China and Russia, for instance, and not really want to talk about how these are being applied to treat people like cattle at home, and how it becomes more inhuman, more impersonal, more sort of machine-based law enforcement and people management at home. That's the hallmarks of a technocracy. That's the conversation we need to have right now.
Yeah, okay, thank you. If you like what the UK column does, you would like to support us, please head over to community.ukcolumn.org. There are options to join us, and you'd be very welcome as a member of the UK column community, or you could pick up something from the UK column shop. But please do share everything that we produce that you find on the various platforms. Now, Patrick, let's move on to elections and Bulgarians protesting the reinstatement of paper election ballots. Could it be that some people aren't liking the electronic voting machines and perhaps the machine learning that goes with that? I don't know.
Well, no, this is actually a really bizarre way to kick this conversation off here. No, they're protesting the reinstatement of paper ballots in favor of machines. So this is a bizarre sort of development in Bulgaria, and the party's called We Continue to Change. This is what the party's called, and supposedly a kind of democratic anti-corruption type outfit in Bulgaria, and they're protesting the switch to the old establishment, i.e., they're saying paper ballots are corrupt. We need electronic voting. So this is bizarre, and I'll bet you I tried to look for the funding of this party, but it's very difficult to see if there's any funding from the National Endowment for Democracy or the Open Society, one of George Soros's umbrella organizations. But here they're saying that today is the day when the democratic vote of every Bulgarian citizen will be substituted, the day when we open the door to 15% invalid ballots, when the distortion of the vote makes the whole system work corruptly. So the event. So they're wanting to bring people out in droves and thousands in this case to protest paper ballots. So this is sort of the opposite of the conversation we thought we were having. So I don't know what you make of that, but that's a new twist, and I personally think there's probably some of the usual suspects that would be backing this type of an effort.
Yes, indeed. I mean, I don't know, but it sounds like it. It sounds highly unlikely that this is anything other than foreign-influenced so-called grassroots movement pushing for something that the foreign influence particularly wants, which is the return of electronic voting machines.
And a lot of people don't realize, Mike, is that electronic voting was pioneered internationally by U.S. companies like Diebold and all these different election systems companies. They did it internationally. South America and Central America were the sort of testing ground for that in the 90s. So electronic voting came in a big after the 2000 presidential election that was contested between Bush and Gore. But all of these systems have been pioneered in, quote, third world countries, in actual countries where the U.S. is, for instance, running military coups or running sort of regime change operations right the way through Latin America. And so they've perfected those. And in some cases, in the case of Brazil, Brazil has been under the electronic voting system for a large part since the mid 90s. So there's a joke in Brazil, inside joke, that Oracle decides who wins the Brazilian elections. So this is the database company that runs the back end, to the electronic voting. So a lot of people, we see the front end, which are the machines and maybe the front end software, but who runs the gigantic back end databases? Well, it's usually, there's only a handful of companies that can do that on the planet. One of them is Oracle. That's an American company. So there's something to learn there and more to discover. So this is a big conversation in America. Carrie Lake, governor candidate in Arizona, she has not conceded yet. So that she's not conceded, and now the pressure's coming on to people in Arizona who have not certified the election last November 28th. That was the deadline. So a lot of counties are refusing to certify it, and so this is an interesting development here. We go to Just the News. This is John Solomon's website here. It's pretty good political commentary out of Washington. Arizona Governor-elect Katie Hobbs, the Democrat. It's a razor-thin race, less than 1%. And it took 2 weeks to count the votes, 3 weeks, 4 weeks. I don't even know if they've finished counting them yet. Nobody knows quite for sure. And she was in charge of the elections as Secretary of State. Huge protests, huge opposition to all the voting machines going wonky on the morning of the election. And she's the one responsible. She's running for governor. And now she's calling for certify her election or face felony charges. Okay, so this is Mojave County. It's one of the more rural counties. Supervisors from Mojave County Board said that they were voting to certify the election under duress, after being warned by Hobbs and her office that they would be arrested and charged with a felony if they did not certify the election, according to Ron Gould, who is the elections board chairman there. So think about that in terms of authoritarianism. They're saying, you accept the election results or else. And so here, just the details of this, November 23rd, a letter from the state elections director, Corey Lorick, and basically saying that the state's office saying that you must certify the certification of the election is not discretionary. And they go on, these are the actual details. The only basis for delaying county canvassing is pursuant to this particular passage here. And if returns from a polling place are missing, and that is undisputably not the case here, if Mojave County does not perform their ministerial duty to canvass your election results today, we will have no other choice but to pursue legal action and seek fees and sanctions against the board. So this is so people are in the local counties being threatened by central office, by the central party, if you will, if you want to think of it in those terms, for threat of being, charged with a felony. What does that entail? Fines, imprisonment. So this is the sort of the Democrats have been decrying democracy is on the ballot. Democracy is in danger. We're in danger of losing our democracy. Well, what exactly do you call this situation? So half the state do not accept the results of this election in Arizona that could well decide the balance of power in the U.S. Senate. And the U.S. Senate will appoint judges on a partisan basis on federal districts right across the country, and those judges will decide whether to hear or to dismiss any challenges to any elections. So you see how this all comes together in one big system politically that's becoming very much weighted on one side of the partisan divide on this. So a lot of people rightly are very concerned about how things are going, and who knows, this could erupt into a much bigger fight if it continues down this road.
Okay, so let's come back onto the issue of freedom of speech and online safety and so on. But we'll start off here with the Washington Examiner. And again, we're talking about Elon Musk. And Musk saying that Twitter interfered in elections and failed in its public trust.
So this is a big admission. So Musk has come out in a tweet. I'll show you the tweet in a second. But basically saying that interfered in the 2020 presidential election. So this would have been verboten. Certainly don't even talk about this on YouTube or other social media platforms without getting either fact check flagged or having your post deleted, or even getting your account struck in with a community guideline strike or taken off completely. Okay, so this is kind of a big deal in this sense. So this now is out in the open. He's talking about the Hunter Biden laptop story that Twitter suppressed and shut down the New York Post as well, who ran the story. It's the fourth largest newspaper in the United States. Gosh, if Putin did that in Russia, they'd be crying to the rafters, screaming. This is a complete violation of democratic international principle. What and this is interesting. So the obvious reality, as longtime users know, is that Twitter has failed in the trust and safety for a very long time and has interfered in elections. Important statement there. Twitter 2.0 will be far more effective, transparent, and even-handed. That's what he's saying. It's a tall order to manage speech on this giant platform, certainly. And he vows to make public all of it was calling the Twitter files on free speech suppression soon will be published on Twitter itself. So he's getting all the internal documents, all the things when Jack Dorsey and co were running a giant censorship farm, basically a political project. Twitter was making a loss. There was no or any intention. It didn't seem like any real effort to make it a profitable company. But it was a giant censorship project for the benefit of one party in the United States. So the public deserves to know what really happened. And he says this is a battle for the future of civilization. If speech is tyranny is all that lies ahead. Okay, we can all agree with those sentiments. Get on board with that. What shape this is actually going to take going forward in terms of there's a lot of pressure from governments on Twitter, European governments, Germany especially as an example, but certainly the UK is going to weigh in heavy on this, and the United States, at least with this administration, somewhat checked by a new Republican. But there's a lot of pressure on these social media companies, lawsuits, and they can force them to moderate speech more heavily through the hand of the regulation of government, whether it's in the EU or whether it's in the U.S. or through the hand of the courts through lawsuits. And even if they're spurious, there's plenty of money available to file lawsuits from all these different sort of more progressive groups that are sort of protecting against hate speech and all the rest of it. So this is just going to go on and it's going to be a problem. His the former head here, one of the former heads of the community safety and trust and integrity, or whatever it's called, trust and safety at Twitter, is basically now, and there's a whole court now of people saying Twitter is now a cauldron of hate speech because there's new management. And so Musk represents this. And so they're saying, oh, it's not safe. Doing the rounds on the kind of circuit there. Yoa Roth is the name of this person. And so he's one of these sort of debrief gatekeeping sessions here at one of these high-end conferences, probably in New York or DC. And his comments are just pretty telling as to what the general attitude is at these Silicon Valley companies with these people in these very high gatekeeping positions that, quite frankly, may not be actually qualified to be advocating on the things that they are, including in the run-up to actual elections in the United States. But if we have that clip, maybe we can play it.
The morning of the Hunter Biden story in the New York Post happens, and it was weird, right? With distance and with what we know now, we forget some of the weirdness. But do you remember the laptop repair guy? Do you remember the uncertainty of the whole story? We didn't know what to believe. We didn't know what was true. There was smoke, and ultimately for me, it didn't reach a place where I was comfortable removing this content from Twitter. Everything about it looked like a hack and leak and smelled like a hack and leak. You did not want to do that. But it didn't get there for me.
So did you just hear that, Mike, at the end? He slipped that in, said this looked like a hack and leak campaign. This was screaming of a hack and leak campaign, like he's some kind of expert on this political phenomenon of hack and leak. They were just basically going along with the same sort of, Julian Assange, or the Russians hacked the DNC, gave the Podesta emails to Assange, he published them, and therefore interventions. And so basically, is this person incompetent? These are people in really key positions of moderating speech across a global space. And are they really incompetent? They don't know what they're going on? Or are they lying? Because he's saying, we really didn't know. The New York Post is the fourth largest newspaper, staked their whole reputation on the Hunter Biden laptop story. Clearly, they vetted the story or they wouldn't have run it. Think of the legal implications if it was fake and they ran with it as a lead story nationwide in the US. It was already vetted by the time the Twitter governance board got their teeth into this story. So, I mean, what's he talking about? The uncertainty. So he really, either these people don't understand the information space in which they are self-appointed to moderate, or they're lying and they're being completely disingenuous. It has to be one of those two, because you can see right in that interview that he was completely winging it. And it's kind of scary, Mike, that these are the people that are put in charge of these really broad-based speech control programs, and they don't appear to be competent or very straight with what they're tasked to be doing. So that was shocking in itself, just to see the attitude, the blasé attitude on that.
Yes, okay, so, but then Musk's free speech agenda dismantles safety work. A Twitter insiders say, of course, this whole issue of online safety is the huge talking point of the day, and but you'll need to explain to me how Musk's free speech agenda dismantles that.
Well, I don't think it does, but what I'm going to show you here is just the barrage of media reports in the last 48 hours. There's like a full court press right across every global mainstream media outlet. So you can see they're setting this up right now. This is the Post. Obviously, the Washington Post is going to run stories like this. There's tons of them, especially in their technology sector. Look at this. Of course, the Israeli government weighing in, saying that Twitter is going to become a cauldron of anti-Semitism globally here. The foreign minister basically saying he's taking a lax attitude towards hate speech, etc. So it's hate speech, hate speech. This is the repeat. And look at this, even with India, with sort of divisive Hindu versus Muslim social schism here. Certain parties' interests in India are saying that, oh, this is going to open the floodgates for hate speech and extremism. India, obviously, that argument's being waged both ways from both sides on different parties on this. So that's just more of the same here. And so this is the problem. And so let's talk about this idea of hate speech. How far can it go? Now, I don't know if the UK column has covered this in the past when it happened, but Germany, unbeknownst to a lot of people, have been doing what's called the annual sweep. They do an annual sweep. It's kind of a tech offensive against hate speech, where the police are deployed en masse to raid the homes of internet users. I was not fully aware of this until recently, and a little bit closer. And yes, it's an actual thing. So in this case, German police they're raiding houses and seizing devices here. German police searched the homes and questioned suspects as part of an annual nationwide crackdown since 2016. It's been ramped up since then against online hate speech here. So this is Fesser, she's the head of state security in Germany there. And so basically, officers investigated 3 women and 6 men aged 17 to 72, and the allegations against them include incitement, hatred, defamation, and libel here. And here's what they're saying: we need to draw clear lines here and get the culprits out of their supposed anonymity. So the German government's really going after anonymous handles. On Twitter, a lot of people sock puppet accounts, or people just want to conceal their identity. I personally am not. I am not against sock puppets myself. I think there's a place for innocent accounts and sort of spoof accounts. I think it creates a more interesting conversation. It's annoying when they're trolling you, but I wouldn't want to deny people that, because I know a lot of people that work in government that are on Twitter and using anonymous handles in order to be able to express themselves, or people that actually work for Apple or Google who do that online. So there is a place for that. I know it's not a perfect system, but anyway, that's the situation. Look at this. Federal police say more than 2,000 politically motivated, quote, crimes are being committed online or recorded each year in Germany, but the actual figure is likely to be higher. This is a mainstream media report So take it with a pinch of salt, because many illegal postings aren't reported to authorities or take place in closed groups. So they want to go after anonymous accounts. They want to go after private groups. They want to go after encrypted chat, WhatsApp, and they want to be able to police and have backdoors to, for instance, they'll be able to access your iPhone without your password. So they're using the sort of counterterrorism license that governments have now in order to access the backdoor into your devices. So they don't need your permission to get to access your device. They're just going to go seize it and take it straight up. So the background of this is interesting, and it's really in here in the New York Times. If you go back to September 23rd, this article reveals a lot here. This article will show you the depth of deep goes. So here's one story that's pretty unbelievable. A 15-year-old father was accused of violating laws against online hate speech, insults, and misinformation. He had shared image on Facebook with an inflammatory statement about immigration falsely attributed to a German politician. And the quote that was misattributed said, "Just because someone rapes, robs, is a serious criminal is not a reason for deportation." So that was wrongly attributed to a politician and a police dawn raid on the home of his 51-year-old father. So the police then scoured the home for about 30 minutes, seizing a laptop, tablets as evidence, said prosecutors here. Wieland, a software developer turned internet hate speech investigator, is in charge of unmasking people behind anonymous. In Germany, he hunts for clues about where a person lives, works, and connections to friends and family. So you're being doxxed by the German government. Okay. Is this being done in other EU countries? Is this being done in Britain? Is this being done in the US or Canada or Australia and New Zealand? That's the question. So being part of the course in China, right? I mean, you probably would have heard this and wouldn't be surprised if that was done in China, but some people might be surprised if it's being done in their own government, in their own backyard. So after an unknown Twitter user compared COVID restrictions to the Holocaust, he used an online registry of licensed architects to help identify the culprit as a middle-aged woman. So the crime there is comparing COVID restrictions to the Holocaust, which is someone's opinion. It's a comparison. It's a metaphor. This is now categorized as hate speech by this new sort of digital Stasi in Germany here. So Margaret Boost, former Green Party member of the German Parliament, was upset by fake remarks that had twisted her support for immigration into an extreme view, which potentially might incite, quote, far-right activists. So that's the justification for the state, for the police moving in heavy on these users, things like this. And the thing they're really concerned about, Mike, is that politicians are being insulted or, quote, harassed. So it's really interesting. So it was that post that eventually led to the raid of the 51-year-old's house. The father, his name was not shared by authorities because of privacy laws. Funny that, is still under investigation. And police will continue to examine his devices. But even if he did not know the comment was attributed or misattributed to Miss Baus was fake, he still faces punishment because the accused bears the risk of spreading a false quote without checking it. So they're saying, the state saying, if you don't do your due diligence in checking a false quote. So all of this is predicated on the assumption that a false quote is not going to threaten a public figure or a politician. That could be single quotes versus double quotes. It could be a misspelling, something like this. So here, several internet speech-related cases are now winding their way through the German legal system. The outcomes have the potential to create a new area of case about what can and cannot be said online, potentially diminishing the role of internet companies, i.e., Twitter, Facebook, Google, as the main arbiters of online speech by moving more to the courts. So you see where this is heading, Mike. is there's basically saying if the corporations aren't up to the task, then it's interesting that the Google, Meta, or sorry, Facebook, it's now called Meta, Google, and Twitter. They just won a court challenge. I think it was in Germany. It's the Network Enforcement Act, which requires companies to notify government when they detect hate speech. So user data to the government without a legal order. So that was the argument that the tech companies won temporary stay of execution in court on the fact that they don't want to be compelled to notify governments every time they detect so-called hate speech, because the court ruled that would violate and undermine personal rights of people. In other words, just without a legal order, the government could just get this stream of reports and doxing and information on citizens. That was deemed to be a bridge too far by the court, you see. So the tech companies they won that temporary state, but that's going to create another sort of path for the state saying, well, look, we're going to have to do this through a giant state bureaucracy, and to have the courts packed with all these different so-called hate speech cases. How are those going to be adjudicated? So that you can see that the whole point, Mike, is the state is just frothing at the mouth to move on this issue. And look at what's happening in Germany. It really shows you where we're heading in the future, in my opinion.
Right. Well, so some really important points to that, Patrick, as we're about to see, because it ties in with this next section. First of all, we've got Joseph Borrell here, who's effectively the European Commission, the European Union's foreign minister. He was at the G20 recently, so he's saying, I just returned from 2 intense days of diplomatic speed dating around the G20 foreign ministers meeting in Indonesia. One of the advantages of such meetings is that we can meet many colleagues in a short period of time, and so on. But he's talking about the global battle of narratives, and he's particularly talking about the global battle of narratives around the war of aggression against Ukraine. He's saying it's in full swing. And for now, he says, we are not winning. So the European Union is not winning in the global battle for narratives around Ukraine. We must continue our efforts to convince our partners while equally being sensitive to their needs. So this is a very interesting comment from him. The EU clearly extremely concerned about that. And I just wanted to highlight what the EU's position is on Twitter, for example. So Twitter will be banned unless it abides by the EU's Digital Services Act. Now, this EU Digital Services Act, we've talked about it many times, is the EU's equivalent of the online harm or the online safety bill, and they've managed to get it passed before the UK has passed the online safety bill, despite the fact that the UK started the process of the online safety bill a long time before the EU did with their Digital Services Act. But they're saying that unless tech companies are willing to abide by the rules, they could be and they will be banned in the EU. Now, we've already seen this to some extent with the issue of video hosting companies being banned in France, for example, or at least the French demanding that both Odyssey and others being asked to take down or stop RT and other Russian media from using their channels, and they, in some cases, they've complied with that, and in some cases, they haven't. But if we look at Politico's coverage of this, their headline is WTF is DSA, what Europe's new content moderation laws means for the internet. And this was the key paragraph that I wanted to highlight in this article. In the event of terrorist attacks, natural disasters, war, or pandemic, the Commission will be empowered to require big tech firms to quickly adapt their services to deal with potential disinformation. Now, what does that mean? Adapt their services? Well, of course, that means censor content. But as well as that, Vanessa, welcome back to the program. We have this organization, the EDMO network. They have all EU member states through 6 new hubs. That's the expansion. Let's just briefly have a look at this. Following the second call for EDMO hubs, the European Commission has selected 6 new hubs that will become part of the European Digital Media Observatory, and strengthening the European ecosystem that fights or that works to fight disinformation. The European Digital Media Observatory, they say, brings together fact checkers, media literacy experts, and academic researchers to understand and analyze disinformation in collaboration with media organizations, online platforms, and media literacy practitioners. They'll deploy a platform to support the work of a multidisciplinary community with expertise in the field of online disinformation. EDMO will contribute to a deeper understanding of disinformation, relevant actors, vectors, tools, methods, dissemination, dynamics, targets, and impact on society. I mean, we must be building a much better society with this type of control of narratives.
I mean, it's extraordinary, isn't it? This is just mass censorship ongoing. And it sounds as if from the language used that they're going to be bringing in sort of legal armament against us also. But there was an article published in the Telegraph also yesterday, which is saying, headlined, Britain is sleepwalking into censorship and we're running out of time to stop it, claiming that we're entering a censorship system far harsher than anything than the EU or the US is proposing, and that Britain would end up with one of the most draconian regimes in the free world. That's extraordinary. That's coming from the Telegraph. So, you know, the writing is on the wall that we're heading into a censorship matrix, which is going to be extremely controlled and policed in the future. And the indication there is also relating back to that concept of it being terrorism, information terrorism. We will become disinformation terrorists. Remember the US State Department funded meeting in Ukraine a few months ago.
Indeed. So look, I really want to reinforce one of the points that I was making on Monday's programme. So this is the BBC with their headline, Online Safety Bill, plan to make big tech remove harmful content axed. And this is about the fact that Michelle Donnellan has decided to remove the so-called harmful, legal but harmful clause and clauses from the Online Safety Bill. But what has actually happened here? This is one very small aspect of this bill, which is so massively complex. It's going to affect not only alternative media outlets, it's going to affect anybody that's running an online forum. It's going to affect all kinds of people in all kinds of ways. But look, here's the key point that I just want to really reiterate. If we look at what was actually said by the government with respect to freedom of speech, they say, as private companies, tech platforms will remain free to set any terms of service that they wish. That's community standards and so on. We've all come against the issue of community standards on YouTube, on Twitter, on Facebook, all these kinds of platforms. The government says the changes mean that companies must keep their promises to users and consistently enforce their users' safety policies once and for all. So in other words, the government is calling out these companies by saying that they've been inconsistent in their responses to content that's on their sites. They've got the terms and conditions in place, and they're not being draconian enough in how those terms and conditions are being applied. They've got to be applied in every instance. It goes on, for example, if a platform says in its terms of service that it does not allow a particular type of legal content such as racist and homophobic abuse or harmful health disinformation, then it must act to tackle it. And if it doesn't act to tackle it, Ofcom will be empowered to take unprecedented action, including levying fines totaling up to 10% of annual turnover. Now, Patrick, very, very briefly, from what you were saying in your segment there, Elon Musk expressing a desire that he doesn't have to actually impose this type of draconian censorship. But while the government has removed or at least has removed its own responsibility for defining what labeled but harmful content is, they're still requiring the tech companies to define that within their terms and conditions, and they're putting on a statutory basis the requirement to enforce those terms and conditions in every instance. So what Vanessa has just said from this Telegraph article about Britain sleepwalking into the most draconian censorship regime, this is absolutely hitting the nail on the head.
Yeah, so Twitter just basically removed COVID medical misinformation from their terms. So they've updated their terms now. So it's no longer, they're not policing COVID, quote, COVID misinformation. The problem is, if you, in your terms of service, if you're explicit about providing a, quote, safe environment for certain topics or subjects, like, for instance, hurtful speech or homophobic. How do you define homophobic? Is some of the top comedians, Dave Chappelle or etc. These people are major public figures. They might have anything within their act that could be construed as, quote, homophobic. So, and a number of comedians and pundits and things like that. How do you define that? So the what Twitter has done here, under the new management, is remove the whole COVID piece to the terms. So they're no longer responsible, or they're not compelled to censor speech that might be, quote, COVID misinformation. So the default position now for Twitter is, as long as it's within the law, as long as it's not incitement, or doesn't incite violence or lead to, or some kind of call for, direct something that's breaking the law. In other words, we're back to square one, or there's already laws on the books. And what's going to happen here is that the problem with Silicon Valley and the regimes at Facebook, Meta, and also YouTube and Twitter, because they're political projects, because one of their main thrusts now is to moderate the conversation politically. Then they're not in the normal business mode. In other words, they're not acting like actual businesses within a normal free market. In a normal free market with any type of product or service or something you opt into, there will be a clause there that says use at your own risk. So that should be first and foremost. If the tech companies want to stay within the law and also protect themselves, then for consenting adults using the platform, there should be an implicit understanding that you are using this platform at your own risk. You may encounter opinions or words that you might find offensive, but as long as it's within the law, then we're not responsible for censoring it. That would be the adult approach, and maybe Internet 1.0 would have taken that approach. But it's the overriding political project that's the problem here. It's not the tech companies, and it's not, quote, hate speech. How do you define hate speech? Even groups that advocate against hate speech, they can't even define it. So the tech companies trying to define it, trying to moderate it, is the problem. And they can alleviate that problem just by taking a step back and saying, just if it's within the law, it's fair game. And if it's rude and it's offensive and it's threatening, fine. Then you can kick it to a moderator and you can have that adjudicated. But otherwise, you can't just go willy-nilly banning, deplatforming people because their opinions or someone told a joke or some sort of satire, which was what Twitter has been doing now for years. Yes. And the other platforms.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks for that. Now, but of course, as we mentioned, the EU is effectively going to be saying to the likes of Twitter, you will impose these rules, or you're not going to be in the EU. So we'll see how that battle pans out over the next period of time. But coming back to the online safety bill, I just wanted to highlight a couple of the new amendments that Michelle Donlan's put in. So she's put in a new clause which requires Ofcom to publish a report on the impact on news publisher content and journalistic content of this regulatory framework that they're putting in. So in other words, the online safety bill is going to require platforms to protect official news publisher content and official journalistic content, only the types of news publishers and journalists that the government approves of. So there's going to have to be a report from Ofcom to ensure that protection is properly managed. And it also allows the Secretary of State to require Ofcom to produce further reports in the future. Another clause which contains exemptions from the offence of false communications, which Patrick was talking about earlier on in Germany. And this clause ensures that holders of certain licenses are only exempt if they are acting as authorised by the licence. So who are we talking about here? Well, again, recognise news publishers or somebody who's holder of a licence under the Broadcasting Act. or somebody who's a provider of an on-demand program service, so long as they're registered with Ofcom and licensed by Ofcom, and so long as they are acting as authorized by the license. And then I just wanted to highlight this for laughs. This organization, the Center for Information Resilience, well, we can see the type of information resilience that they are talking about here. So they work with journalists around the world to expose disinformation and human rights abuses through open source. Here's some of our work, and of course it's all about Russian soldiers running a cleansing operation in Bucha. Russia violence was strategic, and so on. Well, who's just joined this information? Well, none other than Nina Jankovic. So, of course, she had served very briefly as the Executive Director for the Department of Homeland Security's Disinformation Governance Board, and she has just registered in the United States as a foreign agent because she has joined this non-profit-based organization in the United Kingdom, and therefore she's considered as a foreign agent. So registration documents viewed by Fox News Digital show that Nina Jankovic is now working for the Center for Information Resilience. So there we go. Now let's just come back to the COVID issue very briefly here. And of course the COVID inquiry is ongoing. It started a few weeks ago. And they're currently looking for Module 3 core participants. And the deadline for core participants there is the 5th of December 2022 for Module 3. It's been set up apparently to examine the UK's response to and impact to the COVID-19 pandemic. And I think that report from Chris Whitty that we were highlighting at the lead of the programme was to feed into this effectively, I believe. But anyway, I just wanted to make the point that over the last couple of weeks, we've seen articles like this in the Telegraph. COVID inquiry risks whitewash with focus on lockdown advocates, MPs warn. And so many people now talking about the fact that the COVID inquiry being very careful about who they choose or who they select to be core participants, and therefore the narrative being largely controlled. But don't worry, because we have a new pandemic coming along. The next COVID strain will be more dangerous than Omicron, or could be. Scientists warn this is starting to hit the mainstream media, so get your fear tablets down you, because you're going to be getting plenty more fear from the media over this winter. Because Omicron, what are they calling it? They're calling it Deltacrons. Scientists have their eye on several Deltacrons, new COVID variants with the potential to attack the lungs like Delta and spread as easily as Omicron. So there we go. That's what's coming this winter, more fear. And of course, as we saw from Chris Whitty's report, the effect of the fear back in 2020 and 2021, and the long-term effects of that on health and people's excess mortality and so on is absolutely clear. But they're going to keep doubling down on this narrative. Look, I want to say thank you very much to Patrick and Vanessa for joining us today. Sorry about the technical problems. We will be back in a few minutes with some extra, and hopefully we'll get some more detail on things there. So anybody on the main live stream can watch that. Otherwise, we will be back 1 p.m. as usual on Monday. Hope everybody has a great weekend, and we'll see you then. Bye-bye.